a long time, Hebrew was a completely dead language. No one spoke the language for millennia, but then the language was revived and is still being spoken today. Hebrew is the only language that has been revived from having no speakers to 5 million today. Being the only case of language revival in the world, how did this happen? It all began when the new Babylonian Empire conquered Israel. In the Babylonian exile, many Jews had been sent to the city of Babylon. They became known as Babylonian Jews, and even though they continued to use Hebrew for praying and reading the Bible, they mostly spoke Aramaic in day-to-day life like the rest of the Neo-Babylonian people. Then the Persians conquered the Neo-Babylonian Empire under Cyrus the Great. He allowed for the Jews to return to Israel, though still under his control, and he even allowed them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. But when the Jews returned to Israel, their day-to-day language didn't change. They continued to use Hebrew for liturgy and Aramaic for everything else. Fast forward a bit. Alexander the Great has conquered the Persian Empire, and now Alexander's empire has passed into the Hellenistic kingdoms, the biggest of which, the Seleucid Empire, stayed in control of Israel. Now Jews were speaking a dialect of Greek called Koine Greek, except with a few slight differences to make the syntax look more Semitic. The Jews rebelled against the Seleucid Empire and formed the Hasmonean Kingdom, but it saw a civil war 50 years after its formation. As this was going on, the Romans invaded and took control of Israel, which is where everything really began to kick in. The Romans burnt and ransacked the city of Jerusalem, and many Jews had been exiled and sent into slavery. The Jews rebelled. 3 times, in fact. But it was only after the third one, the Bar Kokhba revolt, that all Jews had either been killed, exiled, or sent into slavery. So the Jews migrated outside of Israel. There were 3 main groups, depending on where the Jews ended up after they migrated. First, the Sephardi Jews were the people who migrated to the Iberian Peninsula. Their language ended up becoming what's now known as Judesmo or Judeo-Spanish. His language shows a lot of similarity to other Iberian languages like Spanish and Portuguese, but it has a lot of Hebrew loanwords, especially for terms relating to religion. Then, the Ashkenazi Jews were those who migrated to Germany, and their language became Yiddish, which may ring a bell for most of you. The language had a lot of Old Romance influence, and some Slavic influence too, because of the ways the Ashkenazis migrated from Israel to Germany, often through southern Europe, through Balto-Slavic countries. The same thing which caused the formation of Judesmo happened with the Ashkenazis. More people moved in, more Jewish communities were formed, they isolated themselves, dialects grew apart, and Yiddish. The reason I'm telling you the languages the Jews spoke after the migration, even if it seems like it has nothing to do with the revival of Hebrew, is because Jews were not speaking Hebrew. In fact, they hadn't spoken it since the Babylonian exile of ages ago. They were mostly speaking Arabic, Yiddish, or Judesmo, and although Hebrew continued to be used for religious purposes, no one had used it for day-to-day communication. So you're probably wondering, when will he talk about the revival of Hebrew? Even though no one had spoken it as a day-to-day language since the Babylonian exile, everything changed with the birth of the Zionist movement. The Zionist movement emerged in the late 19th century in Central and Eastern Europe, and it was basically a movement of the Jewish people that was for the re-establishment of a Jewish state in the territory that was historically defined as the land of Israel. At the time, this land was under the rule of the Ottomans, specifically in the region called Ottoman Palestine. Now let me introduce you to Eliezer Ben-Yehuda, who is a man who grew up in Belarus. He studied ancient Hebrew in a cheder, and when Zionism came around, he loved the idea of it. He concluded that Jews worldwide would be united by reviving the Hebrew language. He created the Aliyah, which defined that all Jews have the right to come to Israel. Yehuda regarded Hebrew and Zionism as one and the same, writing that Hebrew can only live if we revive the nation and return it to the fatherland. Jews, who are now in diaspora all across Europe and the Middle East, came back to Israel, still under Ottoman Palestine, through the first and second Aliyah. But at this point, they all spoke different languages: Yiddish, Judesmo, Arabic. How would they communicate? Maybe Yiddish, the most dominant language, Arabic, the language of the region at the time, Aramaic, which was the language they used to speak there? No, they spoke Hebrew. But why? Why did they choose a language that hadn't been spoken for 1,500 years? The Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews, who had both spoken Ladino, Arabic, and Yiddish, needed a way to speak to each other for commercial purposes. The obvious choice was Hebrew. It was a language they all had in common, and it was also the language of the ancestral homeland they had returned to. Ben-Yehuda became known as the reviver of the Hebrew language, and he also made the first modern Hebrew dictionary. And even though modern Hebrew is quite different to ancient Hebrew, it's still the only case worldwide in which a sacred language became a national language. Ben-Yehuda is widely regarded for inventing words which had been forgotten in their original Hebrew usage, like chashmal for electricity, chatzil for eggplant, and gavas for plaster. He also turned to Arabic to borrow words from the language into Hebrew, like the verb higir, derived from hajara, and Retzini, derived from Rosin. Some words have slightly different meanings now, like Divron from Arabic Tamrin. Some expressions, although they sound different, are structured in the same way as those in Arabic. For example, if someone said Boker Tov to you in Hebrew, you would respond Boker Or, literally meaning morning of light, similar to how an Arabic speaker would respond Sabah al-Nur to Sabah al-Khair. Ben-Yehuda was the first person to start a strictly speaking Hebrew household when he moved to Palestine, raising the first native speaker of modern Hebrew, Ben-Zion Ben-Yehuda. He enforced Hebrew on Ben-Zion so strictly, in fact, that he didn't let him listen to the birds chirp, because well, they weren't doing it in Hebrew. But Ben-Yehuda wasn't the only person to revive Hebrew. See, in the 18th century, there was a period called the Age of Enlightenment, when people started to pick up the study of foreign languages. Hebrew was no exception. There was a movement parallel to the Age of Enlightenment for the revival of literary Hebrew during the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment. The members of this movement, the Maskilim, wanted to distance themselves from Rabbinic Judaism, the mainstream form of Judaism since the 6th century, and they decided that Biblical Hebrew was the literary language that should be revived. Even though this was the revival of the literary language, not the spoken, it was finally starting to be written for things other than the Bible in newspapers. Overall, Hebrew was revived in two strings, the revival of the literary language and the spoken language. Again, this has never been done in the history of the world, so now I'm waiting for Coptic to come back. Thanks for watching and have a nice day. Nitcha befam haba.